Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to New Books in Philosophy, a podcast channel with the New Books Network. I'm Sarah Tyson, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado, Denver. I'm co-host of the channel, along with Carrie Figdor, Robert Talisse, and Malcolm Keating. Together, we bring you conversations with philosophers about their new books, drawing from a wide range of areas of contemporary philosophical inquiry. Today's interview is with Vanessa Wills, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the George Washington University. Her book, Marx's Ethical Vision, is just out from Oxford University Press. Does Marx have a coherent ethical vision? How does that square with his sometimes scathing dismissal of morality? What does his critique of capital have to do with ethics? Why is the proletariat the revolutionary class? What is the normative importance of that claim? In Marx's Ethical Vision, Wills provides a careful reconstruction of Marx's understanding of human nature and the possibility of creating a world best suited to our flourishing. Working from Marx's earliest text through his last, Wills shows not only how Marx builds his understanding from material conditions and their historical specificity, but also how doing so can help guide efforts to change the world in ways that support individual growth, self-expression, and development as a universally shared project. Wills consistently argues against philosophical projects that try to salvage Marx's valuable insights stripped of his method. Wills shows that the method by which Marx sought to understand the world and human nature as a force within it is integral to understanding his vision for what ought to be. Vanessa Wills, welcome to New Books in Philosophy.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you there. Let's jump right in. And will you tell us a bit about yourself, your background as a philosopher, and how you came to write this book on Marx's ethical vision?
Certainly. So I'm a philosophy professor. I'm at the George Washington University, but long before I was a philosophy professor, I was a little girl growing up in Philadelphia. So my parents are immigrants from Guyana in South America. And I grew up in a working class Black neighborhood called Germantown. And then when I was a teenager, we moved to a more sort of integrated neighborhood called Mount Airy. And yeah, so I grew up in Philadelphia, went on to college at Princeton, and had my mind blown by philosophy classes mainly. And so decided that was the life for me. And here I am.
Yeah, and then how was it going from Philly to Pittsburgh? Is that an okay
So I
transition for
went,
you? I feel like,
yeah, no, it's interesting. So it was Philly and then Princeton for college and then the University of Pittsburgh for graduate school. And um, Pitt was actually great in so many ways. I mean, the first time that I saw Pittsburgh, which was when I was a prospective student there, because when you're from Philly, you don't actually
well, this
look
is what yeah,
westward
this is what I
very
know,
much.
yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, there's this whole rest of the state there, allegedly, but you don't really sort of make your way over that much. Um, and the first thing that struck me getting off the Amtrak in Pittsburgh was that I had just landed in Gotham City.
Yeah.
So I was a huge Batman fan, still am, but growing up was a huge Batman fan. And so that was my immediate recognition as soon as I landed in the middle of this sort of not just post-industrial city, but a place that had been, Pittsburgh is sometimes called the Paris of Appalachia. And
I've
like,
never heard that.
yeah. And so you have, and which is right, because you kind of have this sense of this place that had quite a lot of robber baron grandeur, right? The sort of legacy of the Carnegies and the Fricks and so on. So all of that is still there in this amazing architecture and these kinds of public institutions, the museums and so on. But in the early 2000s, Pittsburgh was still very much at the beginning of what would become this kind of gentrification, eds and meds renaissance that it's sort of now in the throes of. And so, yeah, so sort of like ending up in this deindustrialized city that was sort of empty, of like the sort of business landscape was not what it had been in the past, but you could see all of the traces of this past a sort of financial largesse of the place. It was, I mean, it's probably not an accident that I became a communist there because you
Okay, so
can,
this is where Marx comes on the scene for you.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I I it was 2003 that the US invaded Iraq, and that was this major eye opener for me because it meant that the sort of the honestly the sort of mainstream ideology of the 90s of this sort of permanently expanding Pax Americana was now thrown into question, and then also the desirability of a Pax America, right? Because the U.S. was clearly operating in this criminal, dehumanizing, destructive, bellicose, and fundamentally irrational way. So it threw up all these questions for me. And I happened to be in this place where there was not only an active sort of community of like left intellectuals around, but also a lot of the echoes is sounds like defeatist or something. I want to say like the legacy is better of a lot of working class organizing and activism. So you had things in Pittsburgh like the Thomas Merton Center, you know, the sort of Catholic socialist, social justice organizing, and you had people who had been active in the union movement for decades, right? You know, and all of these people are around, you know, with all of their history, and in general the history of working class struggle. I mean, it was moving to Pittsburgh, of course, that I learned about the Homestead strike, you know, and about the role of the of the U.S. Kind of like military structure in breaking unions, right, and breaking workers' struggle. So all of that was sort of there. I learned all kinds of new things about the history of industrialization, deindustrialization, and workers' struggle in the United States just by moving westward a little bit, and
Yeah.
getting a different kind of perspective than a very East Coast, sort of Northeast corridor centered one.
And that's where you started to read Marx more seriously and look for his ethical thinking. Was that your
That's
first
right.
interest? Yeah.
That's right. I was going to anti. So as soon as the invasion of Iraq occurred, I was at the first protest that I could find, right? I was out in the streets, and it was the first time in my life that something of that there was as much of a kind of outgrowth of movement activism, and I wanted to be part of it because I thought I wanted, we gotta stop this. We have to put an end to this. And I met socialists. So I met, in particular, I met a woman named Michelle Myers, who she passed a few years later after that. But I met people who had read a bunch of Marx and knew a bunch of Marx, and I at that point had read about Marx, I think, in just one philosophy class that I'd taken as an undergrad, and the context was very much, well, here's a smart guy who wanted good things, but unfortunately was stuck in the backward economic understandings of the mid 19th century, and unfortunately his insights don't transcend that, so too bad. And now we move on to, I don't know, to Rawls, or to, maybe to
Yeah.
Keynes, like maybe. um and so that's what that's all I knew about Marx at that point. And but then I found that I just did not have the grounding. I just didn't have the tools I needed to really help me understand how something so patently irrational could occur, and could happen. And I learning about the analysis that Marx had to offer with respect to the role of economic class and of power, that I was like, oh, okay, so I get it now. Like there's these sort of stratiations in society, and there are people for whom this is in their economic interest, and they're making money off of this, and that gives them a motivation to do great harm, even when it is clearly not going to benefit anyone past the next quarter, right? In a very sort
Yeah.
of small group of people at that. So, so that kind of like sort of peeling back the layers of uh liberal democracy and seeing the sort of like naked power relations that lay behind it, that was very illuminating. And I thought, okay, well, this makes sense not only of the war but a whole lot of things that haven't really made that much sense. um why are there poor people again? Right, and all these things. I was like, okay, this tracks. um but I still had this conviction that not only was the war inherently contrary to the material interests of most people in the US and the world, but also that that mattered somehow, that
Yeah.
was the sort of thing that suggested that it might be immoral as well. And the sort of what I had access to in terms of, I was in a PhD program, I was in the philosophy place, right? But I just wasn't the tools I was getting weren't helping me with that particular problem. And the sort of class-based analysis that I was getting at that point from Marx and from the people I was learning about Marx from was making sense of a lot of things, was really revelatory in a lot of ways, but wasn't necessarily um touching this question of of ethics, right? Of how to talk about the ethics of the war. And so I was like, well, I'll do it. uh
Yeah.
like that just sort of became something that um sort of, more and more I was like, well, I will bring these two things together, my life as an academic and my life as an organizer and somebody who's trying to change the world. The most important question to me seemed to be this one. How do we speak about the about not just that war, but all of the ways that our world is organized in a manner that is contrary to the flourishing of human beings? And what do we want to say about that?
Yeah, and that I feel like that framing for your book, that's your book achieves that,
Thank
pursuing that
you.
question, and through like giving a bunch of tools is one way we could think about what the book does. And so I want to dive into Marx's critique of ideology. And one of the things you say is Marx advocated the ruthless criticism of all that exists, not mindless arson. So that's oh, I love that sentence.
I
And
love it
so
too, so it makes me
it's
so
so
happy
good.
that you
Yeah.
pulled that out.
Well, I mean, because I think it really speaks to how Marx is often read as a mindless arsonist who's got a good vision, but no method or the wrong method or something. So, will you talk about Marx's critique of ideology, or even more broadly, his conception of ideology, where he does spend a lot of time critiquing it, but because he both thinks it mystifies and reveals, right? He doesn't spend all that time parroting Ricardo because he thinks Ricardo's wrong about everything. I'm in the middle of Capital right now with my class. So, what, like, what's valuable about ideology and what's mystifying about it, or how does Marx give us this critique of ideology that lets us see both things?
So one line that I keep coming back to is the second of Marx's theses on Feuerbach, where he is gesturing at this sort of metaphysical question about the essential substance of being, right? So is being with a capital B essentially material, or is it essentially ideal? And Marx, as we know, is a materialist, but what he gives in that second thesis on Feuerbach is not actually he's not weighing in on that sort of metaphysical question. And what he says instead is that he says that this sidedness of our theory, the sort of has to be proven in practice, that it's not just a kind of scholastic question to be debated independently of practice. And I take it that this is of a piece with what he goes on to say in the critique of the German ideology, where he and Engels are describing the development of our ideas as something that itself has a history, and that has a history that is primarily shaped by material relations, by how it is that we are excuse me, interacting with our interacting with our natural world in order to satisfy our biological needs, as this kind of most fundamental base layer of human existence is our interaction with the natural world to satisfy our biological needs. And so the kinds of ideas that we're able to develop are always um, conditioned by the circumstances within which we live, and within which we produce our lives, and within which we also theorize and think and debate about our lives and about what it is that we're doing. One of the things I say in that ideology chapter, I'm engaging with a number of authors, and one of them, Charles Mills, right, who I think formulates a really perspicuously a concern that readers often have with Marx, which is, well, aren't you saying that on the one side is bourgeois thought, or whatever you call bourgeois thought, right? And that is false, mystifying, ideological. And then somehow you have proletarian thought, or whatever you call proletarian thought, and that is supposed to be completely true and unmystified and objective. And whereas the whole point for Marx is that even the correctness of what he puts forward as a proletarian perspective, which is the materialist conception of history, that even the truth of that is not something that can be asserted a priori. It is still the sort of thing that has to be demonstrated through practice. And so he has nothing like a sort of abstract purely theoretical, a priori accounting of why it is that he's always right about everything in advance. I mean, the other thing to say is this is a similar kind of critique, oddly enough, comes from oh my goodness. Why am Karl Popper, right?
Mm.
Karl Popper, right, has actually a similar kind of critique of Marx, this sense that there's something that it's unfalsifiable, right? And that therefore it is really a kind of religious article of faith. But of course, it's not unfalsifiable. There's all sorts of empirical statements that Marx's view depends on. If it turns out that he's wrong in thinking that human beings have the kind of dynamism and complexity and capacity for reshaping their lives that is an absolute precondition of his revolutionary uh, uh, approach, right, and revolutionary aspirations, then we have to stop being Marxists. I mean, the theory would be wrong in that case. If it turns out that actually the uh the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the leaders of society, if it turns out they actually can be convinced on just on the basis of pure rational reflection alone to drop everything and hand power over to the people, then Marx is wrong, right?
Yeah.
And it would be a great reason to do that instead, to just make great philosophical arguments to Elon Musk and wait for the housing and the healthcare and the education, just wait for it to come. Um, I think the way that sometimes people think about how this concept of ideology is supposed to function for Marx, it's misleading, and it gets something wrong about the groundedness in empirical reality that is foundational to Marx. And it also, I think, misunderstands even the status of Marx's own claims, right? These are in fact empirical claims, and they remain to be seen. Like we're trying. um,
Yeah.
yeah. But just to wrap that up, I think um, using the concept of ideology to understand both of these kinds of thought, let's say bourgeois thought and proletarian thought, the reason why it's helpful to use the concept of ideology to describe both of these is that they both emerge out of a set of material conditions shaped by the interests of the groups that they are most associated with. The difference in the case of the working class is that their interests happen to align with the interests of humanity, which of course is also an empirical claim, right? That those statements also need to be tested with respect to.
Yeah, well, and this I think takes us into understanding why Marx's methodology is so important to understanding normativity in his work, which is you spend a lot of time making this case in part, right, because methodology has been jettisoned in so much scholarship on Marx, right? Like, oh, he had some good insights, but the way he got there was bad. And you're really at odds with that view, which seems to be widely held. So will you talk a bit about why his methodology is so important for understanding that there's normativity in his work, and what's up with that?
Yeah. Um, it's it's a funny question. Not your question isn't funny, but like the
I mean, it
but
can be.
it's a right, but it's a funny problem. It's a
Yeah.
funny problem because um on the one hand, if and there's many who do this, on the one hand, to read Marx and to say, I like what this guy is after. I too believe in promoting human flourishing and doing away with unnecessary suffering, and making it the case that as many people have access to the resources they need. Um, but I just think that this guy's going about it the wrong way. I mean, on the one hand, somebody who reads the manifesto, right, or who reads the Estranged Labor manuscript and has the thought, this guy, yeah, what he's pointing out, that is bad, and we should do away with it. This person, of course, is my friend, right? Like this is, so on the one hand, I want to acknowledge that, but on the other hand, um, this person, I think, is under the sway of a way of thinking about the relationship between ends and means that is doomed.
Yeah.
And uh, because of course the identification of ideals like solidarity and human brotherhood and sharing, um we don't need Marx for that. Obviously, sort of obviously, right? These are the same ideals that you could and should have as a Christian, for example, or even a Kantian, right? Like you don't
Mhm.
even have to, you don't have to be deep in the weeds of a explicitly religious uh outlook either. Um, so what is distinctive about Marx, I think, is the methodology. And this is one of the reasons why I take up the question of the history of analytical Marxism in the discipline, and ask whether it is in fact a type of Marxism, which is not just a sort of petty infighting, but goes to this question of um, is it enough to agree on the end alone, but have such disagreement about the means? Now, what is distinctive, I think, about Marx, is well, among other things, is a set of methodological commitments, um, like the question of methodological holism, right? So if you don't think that it's possible to speak of what an entire group of human beings is doing as a result of the economic organization of their society, that makes it the case that we can speak of certain economically delineated subsets of human beings as acting collectively in a certain way, or as being subject to economic laws all in exactly the same way, then that is something that I would say, right, is in tension, at least, with accepting the most useful and the most distinctive aspects of a Marxist perspective. Now, there might be all kinds of reasons for jettisoning that kind of economic story that Marx is telling, and that's fine. But it just, I think the sort of rationale for calling oneself a Marxist in the way that Marx would have recognized as adhering to the materialist conception of history, it is a bit obscure in that case.
Right.
Right.
What's the motive at that point?
Right.
Well, and it seems like you haven't dealt with his theory to reject it at that point. You're just sort of
Doing
saying it's
something
not right.
else.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, doing something else. Um, and that's why I sort of begin with the, like, if the thing you're doing is also what you consider your best attempt to bring about these ends, like that's fantastic. But I do at least in my book I really wanted to, um or let's even set aside that question, but to understand what it is that Marx himself is doing, rightly or wrongly. I think that is impossible to do without being willing to entertain that what he's doing is something very different from what the mainstream of analytical philosophy is doing today, even though it is still continuous with some of analytical philosophy's Enlightenment tradition of of reason, science, objectivity, universality, and so on.
Yeah. And so one place that you go is on the question of alienation um, to think through how he's developing his analysis. And you point out that he abandons the term and that there might be good reasons within the context he's writing for him to move away from the the term itself. But you argue that alienation remains a really important conceptual tool that he is using and that he is looking for and that he is elaborating. So will you talk a little bit just about I was interested in how you followed the evidence that he never abandons alienation, but maybe more importantly is what's at stake in seeing alienation as something that Marx sticks with throughout his entire theoretical work.
Yeah, so there's two German words that in English translation are frequently translated as alienation, and the German words are Entfremdung, which is sort of like literally like making strange, right? Making alien, and Äußerung, which is sort of objectifying or making something outside or externalizing something. And for Marx himself tends to use these interchangeably, and they're both translated into English typically as alienation. And there comes a point where he stops using either of these terms to describe the thing that in his earlier works, like in the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, he's calling alienation. And or in English, sometimes it's also estrangement, right? Um, and so when he describes alienation, one of the ways that he describes it is as this process through which what is initially and properly yours or part of you now stands in this external and hostile relation to you, so that you are facing what is initially and properly yourself and your own as this hostile other that confronts you as an enemy. And the now this this sounds like I mean like it's probably not an accident that this has a very kind of gothic kind of feel to it, like like
Yeah.
right, it's a bit like a it's a bit like a horror story, right? But what Marx is describing is is this thing that's grounded in an economic process through which I uh, sell my labor power as a commodity, and it is now the property of my employer, my boss, who is enriched by the labor that I perform, which now literally is congealed in the form of products, capital, just cash, right?
Yeah. The money
The
form.
factory,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, the money for right, the factory itself, the person themselves who is fed and sustained by my labor, right? And meanwhile, I, the laborer, am made poorer, am diminished, stultified, limited, and degraded. So I see, but when I see the boss standing in front of me, opposing me, um, wanting to have as much of the profit from my labor as possible, while I want to uh, earn as much from my labor as I can to sustain my needs. Now this a relationship of alienation, which had that, as we said, that kind of gothic horror, supernatural feel to it, is just a literal description of what is happening economically. The more I work, the richer he gets, and he's my enemy, right? So I am literally confronting my own productive power in the form of my enemy, which I have produced, right? Um, and so this relationship is one that Marx never disavows. This is always his description of what is happening in that labor relation, in the relation of wage labor. He never backs away from it. He continues to describe the relationship between boss and worker in exactly these terms all the way through his work. And so not only that, but he also speaks of other kinds of the sort of relationship that we have to one another, right? The extent to which our work is done as a sort of mere means to the sustenance of our biological bodies, right? Sort of just like something that we do in order to survive, as opposed to something that I do in order to express myself, something that I do as a social response to the needs of another person. All of those features that Marx sees as hallmarks of unalienated labor are ones that he continues to describe and continues to describe as unrealized and frustrated and prevented by capitalism. Now, the stakes of why this matter, one reason it matters, I think, is just because it's a good theory,
Yeah.
and we need, and so we want to understand what is it that Marx is saying about alienation, but it's also extremely central to the question of Marx and ethics, because one very common argument given for thinking of Marx as someone who perhaps is interested in ethics early on, but loses interest later on, is that he supposedly abandons the concept of alienation, which is doing a lot of normative work, including on my reading of Marx, is doing a lot of the normative work of the kind of ethical perspective being offered. And so if he at some point backs away from alienation and doesn't think it exists, that's one good reason to endorse a reading on which Marx stops having an ethical content at all. But I just don't think that that's borne out by the text, that he continues to speak of the concept of alienation even where he's using different terminology.
Yeah, it's hard to understand the analysis in Capital if it's not an exploration of alienation, right? Like that's
I think
core
that's
to the analysis in this later work, it
I think
seems.
that's exactly right. I think, commodity fetishism is alienation. Is that we, the whole, because capital also has that kind of gothic horror story
Vampires,
structure.
werewolves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, in this sense of, we see the commodities doing this and that, and then, but it was you all the time, right?
It's in the house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in the house. Yeah, the
Yeah.
calls come from inside the house, and
Yeah.
and 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 it's saying you're alienated.
Value's not what you think it is.
Right.
Even for the bourgeoisie. And I think you
That's
make this
exactly
point a
right.
lot, right? Which is that it's more important is what's happening to workers, but it's not like the bosses are escaping the issue. Um, they just also get what he sometimes calls like this world of culture and art that comes with it.
That's
But
exactly right. Yeah. Or he'll say that they are able to have a semblance of a human existence. And yeah, if they want to take up a new hobby, they can. They can, and this is, I'm not, it sounds sort of petty, but this actually matters, right? Because one of
yeah,
the things that Marx thinks is crucial to unalienated life is precisely this: the ability to take up new pursuits and to go as your interests lead you. So the capitalist class, they often can do this, right? They can take up new hobbies, they can travel to places and learn new things, and they can do all of this. But the problem is that you cannot actually fully solve this problem of alienation on your own. And even though the bourgeoisie, they try, they go to Pilates, they hire their life coaches, they join cults. I mean,
They eat
like
organic.
all of
Yeah.
right, yeah, exactly. All of these things that are like just they in Silicon Valley they like body hacking, they right like all of these things that are actually just like everyday parts of bourgeois life, and that are symptomatic of their alienation and their sense of something's missing, that can't be solved even with all the billions in the world. Now the problem is that they're going to take their chances with the billions.
Right.
They're going to keep trying, right? And so this is why Marx thinks it's one of many reasons that he thinks it is the working class that actually has the potential to solve this and other problems for humanity. But yeah, but the bourgeoisie, they have the same issues.
So then what is freedom for Marx, right? If the people with the billions, if this isn't really human freedom, then what is freedom for Marx?
Yeah, I mean, so one one thing to say is that there's even a more fundamental value for Marx, and that is survival. Like, and there's a because there's a worry, and this is again a matter of prediction, about which he could be wrong. Uh, but the prediction is that the crises of capitalist society cannot be solved by capitalist society, and that the outcome of the processes that we observe now will necessarily be the destruction of humanity, will be the death of the species, or at least the destruction of the species to an extent that makes it so that what's left is recognizable only as the same mammal, the same type of mammal that was there before, but that the historical and cultural and artistic, all of the sort of legacies of the whole history of human development up till now, um, is deeply imperiled by things like collapse, pandemics, war. I mean, we see it now. We see it not only now, but so often the aim in wars is the cultural destruction of another people. I think we are seeing that most horrifically displayed with the destruction of schools and museums in Palestine and Gaza, right? So the worry is that there's this existential threat to humanity, as a social creation of generations of human beings, throughout our time on the planet. So the reason why I highlight that is that it's this argument that is the central Marxist advertisement for trying to move beyond capitalism, right? Is the worry that if we don't, what we will have instead is just the destruction of humanity as such. And if we think that one of the accomplishments of human social development around the world has been an expansion of freedom, an expansion of our avenues for creativity, for productive interaction, for expression of our desires, our interests, our just ourselves. If we think that that's something that we are glad has emerged and that we want to see develop further, then that is of course contingent on our survival. which is imperiled by capitalism, which is imperiled by the very same thing that has inarguably developed human freedom quite a bit, that takes freedom as one of its ideals. I mean, these are facts about liberal democracy, and about its effect on humanity, but the contradiction, of course, is that it can only develop those things to a certain extent that we probably are at. We've probably gone about as far as we can go with this. And what lies ahead is either continuing to develop our human freedom or seeing it go up in smoke along with anything recognizably human about our life as a species.
Yeah, and I think you're sketching a response to this already in what you're saying, but what do we need to understand about Marx's theorization of human nature to understand why morality could wither away, why the long struggle of building a communist society, the long struggle of revolution could lead to the withering away of morality?
Yeah, so this goes to one of the sort of the weirdest thing I say in the book, in a book full of weird things to say, but because we do get Marx saying, for example, that the communists do not preach morality, um, and and you're right. What I just said sort of prepares the ground for explaining what he might mean by that. Because on the one hand, it clearly is a matter of moral concern when we're talking about the survival of humanity,
Mhm.
right? Whether we want to promote our continued development and flourishing, or whether we will continue to allow capitalism to destroy us, right? And but it's not a question that Marx is answering sort of on pure abstract moral grounds, right? The question of communism is put to those who whose only chance at their individual survival is attempting to bring about the conditions of human flourishing generally, right? And so it's not a sort of abstract moral question. This is, I think, one of the places where the distinction between a Marxist perspective and a liberal one really comes to the fore. You see this with Marx's disagreements with John Stuart Mill and vice versa, where Mill correctly understands that the determinism of Marxist theory is not what people think it is, this kind of
Mhm.
strict deterministic, everything is like Newton's physics, but for people, that's not the determinism of Marxism. The determinism of Marxism is saying we are headed to a choice, right? We are headed down a bifurcated path. And at the end lies only the choice for socialism or our destruction. And this is the thing that Mill denies. And Mill just says, how do you know that? It might, capitalism might turn out fine. So it becomes this epistemic debate about what is knowable and about what kinds of further human development are compatible with what kinds of material economic life and so on. And so if capitalism could be fine, then we have merely then it becomes more obviously a kind of purely ethical question of taste, of like which do we do, capitalism or socialism? I don't know, like capitalism's working out pretty good for me, like, but if the choice is communism or human destruction, right? The collapse of our environment, the collapse of all of our forms of social life that sustain us, then okay, that's clearly ethical. There's something ethical going on here, but the choice that I'm actually putting to you is whether you want to live or die. And that's not, that is an ethical choice, but
That's more
the
straightforward.
real,
Yeah.
but it's more straightforward, right? It's like, do you want to live or do you want to die? And this is where the sort of rootedness of Marxism in a theory of human survival really, really begins to matter. And it's also, to loop back to our methodological question, it's also where Marx's historical materialism, right, really matters, because that is the basis upon which he is making these predictions about how capitalism is likely to turn out and what our best chance out of here might be. So just like to give that like a little 30-second wrap up that speaks more directly to your question, which is like one of the most important questions of the book. It really the interests of working people um, themselves represent a sort of point of transition between both the possibility of realizing fully an ethical conception of human development and human flourishing, of a kind of Aristotelian moment of making it the case that human beings are in appearance, that they actually appear in reality in a way that is a fulfillment of their essence as creative, um, actively producing rational self-changers. And Marx uses this term self-changing sometimes to talk about labor. So it both represents a moment with the opportunity to fulfill the aspirations of morality for human being, and also this transitional point of making it the case that the question, it loses its kind of strictly ethical character and becomes a practical question of survival. And I think the to the extent that Marx talks about a kind of abolition of morality, that is a a way of understanding that, right? That it becomes not just a sort of strictly abstract ethical aspiration, it's resolved into this question of survival. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Yep. So what are you working on now?
Yeah, so what the biggest thing going on now is I'm working on a second book, and it has a working title, Black Women Marxists on Race, Gender, and Class, which is a bit of a mouthful, but that's the
Sounds
working
great.
title for it. Thank you. And it's motivated by the thought that a number of our debates that we have among intersectionality approaches, critical race theory, feminism, and of course, Marxist approaches to understanding and fighting oppression, that there's a lot to be gained from learning from the work and lives of Black women in the working class movement. And so looking at figures like Claudia Jones, like Angela Davis, Louise Thompson Patterson, Assata Shakur, right? Looking at women who thought that class-based analysis was central in their analysis of race and gender, but nonetheless, cannot be accused, I don't think, of relegating race and gender to too small a role, and or being unserious, of course, about battling racism and sexism. So this is an attempt to learn from them and to use those insights to understand some of our contemporary debates about these questions.
Can't wait.
Thanks. Thank you.
Well, Vanessa Wills, thank you so much for our conversation.
Thank you. This was lovely. Thank you so much.
Okay.